Hey everyone, welcome back to Mr. Not Horror. If you're ready for a story that'll give you chills, make sure to like, subscribe, and let us know where you're listening from in the comments. Now, get cozy, relax, and let's begin today's spooky tale. I pulled off the highway and onto the snow-covered road that led to the small village. The windshield wipers of my old car creaked as they struggled to clear the heavy snow, but I was determined to make it through the storm. The forecast had predicted a light dusting, but as the snowflakes grew heavier, I realized I was heading straight into a blizzard. My hands gripped the steering wheel, knuckles white, eyes glued to the barely visible path ahead. The village was not far now, just a few more miles, and I could already see the faint outline of a single streetlight cutting through the dark. When I'd left the city, I had hoped for peace, for silence, away from the noise of my work and the chaos of life. This small, remote village seemed like the perfect place to spend a few days and clear my mind. But the closer I got, the more the hairs on the back of my neck stood up. The road twisted and turned as I passed through dense trees. I could barely make out the silhouettes of old houses through the thick snowfall. Then the village appeared, a row of houses with warm, inviting lights flickering through frosted windows. But something about it felt wrong. I couldn't put my finger on it, but there was an odd stillness in the air, an unnatural quiet. I found the inn at the edge of the village. It was a small, charming building with a sign that read, "The Silver Lantern," swaying gently in the wind. As I stepped out of the car, the cold bit into my skin immediately, biting into my bones. I looked around, hoping to see someone to ask for directions or just a friendly face to help me settle in. But there was no one. The street was empty. A faint smell of wood smoke hung in the air. But there were no voices, no sounds of life. I shook my head and walked up to the inn's door. As I reached for the handle, the door opened on its own, and a thin, gaunt man stood in the threshold, his eyes wide and unblinking. He didn't say a word as he stepped aside, allowing me to enter. The warm air of the inn enveloped me, but there was something off about it. The room was dimly lit, shadows stretching long across the wooden floor. "Good evening," the man said in a low voice, his eyes fixed on mine. "I'm Gregor. You'll be staying here for the night, I assume?" I nodded, but his gaze lingered too long, and I felt a cold shiver run down my spine. "Yes, just for the night. The storm. It's bad out there." He nodded slowly, his eyes narrowing as he looked at the window. "It gets worse, you know," he murmured, almost to himself. "People don't leave in this weather. Not unless they have to. You should be careful." I tried to ignore the unease creeping through me. "I'll be fine. Just need a warm bed," I said, trying to brush off his cryptic words. He motioned for me to follow him upstairs. The hallway upstairs was narrow and dimly lit, with old portraits lining the walls. Their eyes seemed to follow me as I walked by. I couldn't help but feel like they were watching my every move. But I kept my focus forward, refusing to let the paranoia take hold. Gregor led me to a small room at the end of the hall. The bed was made with crisp white sheets, and the faint smell of lavender hung in the air. It was cozy, almost too cozy for a place that looked so decrepit on the outside. He didn't say anything as he opened the door for me, but when I stepped inside, I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched. "Good night," Gregor said, his voice thick with something I couldn't place. "Remember what I said? Be careful." "Right, thanks," I muttered, closing the door behind me. I dropped my bags on the floor and sat on the bed. The storm raged outside, the wind howling through the cracks in the walls. But inside, it was quiet. Too quiet. I tried to distract myself by flicking on the old television set in the corner of the room. Static filled the screen for a moment before it settled on a late-night talk show, the sound muffled and distant. I glanced out the window at the snowstorm, my thoughts drifting back to Gregor's strange warning. Be careful. What could he have meant by that? Was there something about this village that wasn't right? I shook my head, trying to push the thoughts away. It was just a small town, nothing to be afraid of. The wind howled again, louder this time, as if the storm were trying to force its way into the room. I pulled the blanket up tighter, trying to shake the growing sense of dread. But something was wrong. I could feel it. The silence in the room was oppressive, and my heartbeat was too loud in the stillness. Suddenly, I heard it. A faint sound. so quiet at first that I wasn't sure I'd heard anything at all. A whisper. It came from somewhere behind me, too soft to make out the words, but its presence made the hairs on the back of my neck stand up. I turned around, my heart pounding in my chest, but the room was empty. No one was there. Yet the whispering continued, like a faint murmur in the air. I rushed to the door and flung it open, but the hallway was empty. The same eerie silence lingered, thick and oppressive. I stood there for a moment, frozen, wondering if I had imagined it. But as I stepped back into the room, the whispering grew louder, coming from the walls themselves. I couldn't understand what it was saying, but it didn't matter. It was clear that it wasn't just the wind. Someone or something was here with me. I ran to the window and looked out into the storm, searching for any sign of life, but the village was still. No lights, no movement, just the endless blizzard swirling and howling against the darkness. Then, a shadow crossed the street, a figure, barely visible against the swirling snow, standing in front of the inn. I squinted, trying to make out who it was, but the figure seemed to shift, bending in unnatural ways. The figure was watching me. No, not just watching, waiting. The whispering grew louder still, now joined by another voice, higher pitched, frantic. It sounded like a woman, her voice pleading, but I couldn't understand her words. My pulse quickened. I backed away from the window, heart racing. My thoughts raced. What had Gregor meant by "be careful"? Why was there no one else around? The air grew colder. The room seemed to close in on me. I could feel it now, the presence, something watching, something waiting. I knew I had to leave. But when I reached for the door, it wouldn't open. The knob turned, but the door wouldn't budge. Panic set in as I rattled the handle, shaking it desperately. My breath came in short gasps, the cold air biting at my skin. The whispering grew more intense, like a chorus of voices, all speaking at once, their words distorted and incomprehensible. Then, the door creaked open, and I stumbled backward. In the doorway stood Gregor, his face pale, his eyes wide and lifeless. "You shouldn't have stayed," he whispered, his voice barely audible over the storm. "You never should have come." I wanted to scream, to run, but I couldn't move. His cold gaze locked onto mine, and I realized, with sickening clarity, that I was not alone. The village had never been empty. It had always been waiting. And now, it was too late. I hadn't intended to stop in the small town. In fact, I hadn't planned to stop anywhere at all. I had hoped to make it to my destination before nightfall, but the storm had come out of nowhere, a swirling mass of snow that blanketed the road in seconds. The headlights of my car barely cut through the heavy white haze as I searched for any sign of shelter. That's when I saw it, a flickering light in the distance. A small village, barely more than a cluster of houses, its street lamp casting a faint, trembling glow through the snowstorm. My heart sank with a strange sense of relief. It wasn't much, but it was something. I needed a place to rest, and fast. I pulled into the village and drove slowly down the narrow, snow-packed street. The place seemed deserted, not a soul in sight, though the buildings appeared well kept, the windows glowing warmly in the otherwise still night. I turned a corner and spotted the inn. Its sign swayed gently in the wind, creaking like an old door. The amber lantern, it read, and beneath it, the promise of warmth and shelter. I parked my car and got out, the wind biting through my coat as soon as I stepped outside. The air felt thick, as if it was pressing against me. I made my way inside, hoping for a warm fire and perhaps a drink to take the edge off. The moment I walked in, I was greeted by the smell of stale wood and damp earth. The inn was small, cozy even, but the atmosphere was wrong. There was a silence hanging in the air, an unsettling stillness that didn't belong in a place that should have been bustling with travelers, seeking refuge from the storm. The dim light flickered from a fire in the hearth, casting long, strange shadows across the room. A man stood behind the counter, his eyes meeting mine without a smile. He was thin, gaunt even, with skin so pale it seemed almost translucent. His hair was a stark white, and though he looked to be in his 60s, his face seemed younger, smoother, almost unnaturally so. "Looking for a room?" he asked, his voice low and dry. I nodded. "Yes, please." "Just for the night," I said, forcing a smile. Something about the man's gaze made me uneasy, but I chalked it up to fatigue from the drive. He gave a slow, deliberate nod, his eyes never leaving mine, as he handed me a key. "Room 3, he murmured, his tone even colder than the air outside. I took the key and made my way upstairs, feeling the weight of his gaze still pressing on my back. The hall was narrow, the walls lined with faded paintings. Their eyes seemed to follow me as I walked past them, but I pushed the thought away. I had to get some rest. The storm was only getting worse, and I could hear the wind howling outside, rattling the windows, like a madman trying to get in. I reached my room and unlocked the door. Inside, the room was as expected, quaint, with a bed draped in heavy blankets, a small writing desk, and a large window that looked out onto the snow-covered street. I set my bag down and glanced around. It was cozy, but the same oppressive silence that had filled the inn seemed to seep into the room with me. I shook it off, went to the window, and peered out. The village was silent. Not a single light on the streets. No movement. It was as if everyone had vanished, leaving nothing behind but the snow and the quiet. I turned away from the window and sat on the edge of the bed, reaching for the small lamp on the nightstand. As my fingers brushed the lamp's cool surface, I heard it, a sound so faint that I wasn't sure if I had imagined it. A soft, rhythmic tapping, coming from somewhere down the hall. I froze, straining my ears to catch the sound again. There it was, unmistakable. It was a knock, gentle but persistent. 3 taps, followed by a pause. 3 taps again. Curiosity mixed with unease, and I stood up, drawn toward the door. I slowly cracked it open, peering down the dim hallway. There was no one there, just the faint shadows of the paintings on the walls, their eyes now seeming to leer at me. I stepped out into the hallway, looking around. The tapping had stopped, but my heart raced with a growing sense of dread. I was alone. I had to be. Yet, something felt wrong. As I turned to go back into my room, I heard it again. The tapping, this time louder, as if it was right behind me. I spun around, my breath catching in my throat, but there was no one there. "Hello," I called out, my voice sounding foreign in the oppressive silence. There was no response. I backed into my room, shutting the door quickly behind me. My hands were shaking as I locked it. I sat on the bed, my mind racing. Had I imagined it? No, the sound had been real. But who could it have been? There were no other guests, not that I had seen. I turned to the window again, hoping the view might offer some comfort. But instead I was met with an eerie sight. A figure stood outside just beyond the snow-covered windowsill. It was a man, dressed in tattered clothes, his face hidden in the shadows of the night. He stood motionless, staring directly at me. I recoiled in shock, my breath catching in my throat. He didn't move, didn't blink, just stared, unmoving, through the snowstorm. I grabbed the phone beside the bed and dialed the front desk. The line rang and rang, but no one answered. I tried again, but still, there was no response. My heart pounded in my chest. Something wasn't right. The wind howled louder, almost as if it were urging me to leave, to run, to escape this suffocating feeling. I looked back out the window. The man was still there, but now his face was visible. His eyes were hollow, empty, like 2 pits of darkness. A smile stretched across his face, unnatural, wide, and grotesque. Suddenly, a cold rush of air swept through the room, even though the window was closed. The temperature dropped, and I could see my breath forming mist in the air. The shadows in the room began to stretch and twist, moving as if alive, creeping toward me. I stumbled backward, panic rising in my chest. Something was wrong with this place, with this entire village. The door to my room slammed open. Standing there in the doorway was Gregor, the innkeeper. His face was pale, his expression unreadable, but the look in his eyes was something far worse, hollow, as though whatever humanity had once been in him had been drained away. "You shouldn't have stayed," he whispered, his voice low and eerie. "You never should have come." Before I could say anything, he stepped forward, and I realized with growing horror that there was no escape. The village was no longer just a place. It was a prison, and I was its latest inmate. Behind him, I could see the shape of the man from outside. He was in the hallway now, his eyes locked on mine, and his smile had only grown wider. As the door closed with an ominous creak, I realized there was no way out of this place. No way to escape the horrors that waited inside the amber lantern. I was trapped, and the tapping had only just begun. I hadn't planned to be out on the road that night, especially not with the storm blowing in from the north. The snow had started in the late afternoon, harmless at first, but it quickly turned into a full-blown blizzard, and by the time I realized how bad it was, I had already passed the last town for miles. I kept driving, hoping to find some kind of shelter, but the snowstorm seemed to erase all signs of civilization. No lights in the distance, no gas stations or motels. Nothing but the endless sea of white. That's when I saw it, a flicker of light, almost lost in the swirling snow. It wasn't much, but it was enough for me to make a decision. I turned off the road, my car crunching over the thick layer of snow, heading toward the faint glow. The sign came into view as I approached. Harrow Inn, an old, weather-beaten place that looked as if it hadn't seen any guests in years. But it was a building, and it was a shelter. I had no choice. I parked and stepped out of the car. The cold hit me like a slap in the face, but I pressed on, moving toward the door. As I reached for the handle, I hesitated. Something about the place felt wrong. The windows were dark, the door old and chipped with peeling paint. But the light inside was warm, inviting, and I was desperate for warmth. I knocked, the sound muffled by the storm. After a few moments, the door creaked open, revealing a thin man with sharp features and deep-set eyes. His hair was slicked back, and his skin had an ashen hue to it. "Can I help you?" he asked, his voice cold and clipped. "I'm sorry to bother you," I said, trying to force a smile. "I've been caught in the storm. Do you have a room available?" He stared at me for a long moment, as if considering whether or not to let me in. Then, without a word, he stepped aside and gestured for me to enter. The warmth hit me immediately, but it wasn't comforting. It felt heavy, like the air was thick with something more than just heat. Inside, the inn was surprisingly quaint. Wooden beams stretched across the ceiling, and the flickering fire in the hearth added a touch of charm to the otherwise dark and shadowed room. A few old portraits hung on the walls, their faces obscured by the smoke in the air. The man behind the counter didn't offer any pleasantries, as he led me to a small room on the second floor. "It's not much," he said, his voice strangely flat, "but it's all we have." The room was small, with a narrow bed and a single window that looked out onto the storm. The snow was falling thick and fast, and I could barely make out anything beyond the glass. I dropped my bags onto the bed, thanking the man as he left without another word. I stood by the window for a moment, staring out at the endless snowfall. There was something about the silence that unnerved me. Not the usual quiet you'd expect in a remote place, but an oppressive, unnatural silence. The wind howled outside, but inside, there was no sound. No creaks in the floorboards, no soft whispers from the hall. Just stillness. I shook it off, telling myself it was just the storm. I needed rest. But when I turned away from the window and looked back into the room, the shadows seemed deeper, the corners darker. My mind was playing tricks on me. I knew it. I sat down on the bed and pulled the blanket around me. The bed felt uncomfortable, as though it hadn't been slept in for years, and I shifted restlessly, trying to get some sleep. The storm outside intensified, the wind rattling the window like an invisible hand, trying to get in. But it wasn't the storm that kept me awake. It was the sound. At first, I thought it was just the wind, but as I lay there, the noise grew clearer. A faint tapping, slow at first, like someone drumming their fingers on the wall. I sat up in bed, my pulse quickening. The tapping continued, getting louder and more insistent. I looked around the room, but there was no one there. The walls were solid, the floorboards still. It was just me. I tried to shake it off, but the sound grew louder still. I stood up and walked to the door, my hand hovering over the handle. The tapping was coming from the hallway now, just outside my room. I opened the door and peered into the dark corridor. There was nothing there, just the long, empty hallway, the flickering light from a single overhead bulb casting strange, uneven shadows along the walls. I could feel the cold seep into my bones, but the tapping had stopped. My heart was racing as I stepped back into my room and closed the door behind me. It was then that I noticed it. The window. The snow was no longer falling outside, the storm had stopped, and the night was still. But something was wrong. The view outside was no longer what it had been. The scene had changed. Where there had once been a blizzard, there was now a quiet frozen forest, the trees bending under the weight of snow, their branches reaching out like skeletal hands. In the distance, I could see a figure standing among the trees, tall, impossibly tall, its form obscured by the mist that hung in the air. I gasped and stumbled back from the window. What was happening? How had the view changed so suddenly? I rushed to the door and threw it open, desperate to escape the oppressive atmosphere of the room. But there was no one in the hall. The inn was eerily quiet, and I was sure I could hear my own breathing echoing through the empty building. I rushed down the stairs, the tap of my shoes the only sound. But when I reached the lobby, I froze. The man, the innkeeper, was standing behind the counter, his back to me. He hadn't moved since I arrived, and now he didn't even acknowledge my presence. He was staring at something just out of view. I slowly approached him, my heart hammering in my chest. "Excuse me," I called out, but there was no response. I stepped closer, but just as I was about to tap him on the shoulder, the innkeeper turned to face me. His face had changed. His skin was pale, stretched tight over his bones, his eyes wide and empty. His mouth was frozen in a grotesque smile, one that didn't belong on a human face. "You shouldn't have stayed," he whispered, his voice cold and hollow. I wanted to scream, to run, but my feet wouldn't move. My body was frozen in place, and I could feel the weight of his gaze pressing down on me. Behind him, the room seemed to distort, the walls closing in like they were breathing. Then, just as suddenly as it had begun, everything stopped. The innkeeper was gone, the lobby was empty, and I was standing alone in the middle of a cold, dark hallway. The storm outside had started up again, but there was no escape. The inn had become a labyrinth, its walls shifting and closing in on me. I ran through the hallways, desperately searching for the exit, but every door led to the same dark corridor. Every window showed the same frozen forest. There was no way out. The tapping started again. This time, it was louder, closer, and I knew. It was coming for me. And then, just as I thought I couldn't run anymore, the door at the end of the hallway opened. I stumbled toward it, barely able to stand, and as I stepped through, the world around me shifted. The storm outside had stopped. I was back in the snowstorm, but this time, the village was gone. No lights, no inn, just the endless white. And I was alone. The tapping had stopped. The storm had stopped. But I could still hear the voice. "You shouldn't have stayed." I'd been driving for hours, following the winding mountain road through the thickening fog. The sun had long since dipped below the horizon, leaving only darkness and the sound of my tires crunching over the gravel. The storm had come in fast, a heavy downpour of rain that turned the road slick and treacherous. But I couldn't stop now. I was too close to my destination, and I had promised myself I'd reach it. I'd heard the stories, whispers of an old mansion deep in the mountains, abandoned for decades, but still standing. Everyone in town spoke of it as if it were cursed, a place where strange things had happened over the years. But curiosity had gotten the better of me, and I decided to find it, hoping to uncover the truth of the rumors once and for all. After what felt like an eternity, I finally saw it. Druxton Manor. It rose out of the mist like a dark sentinel, its silhouette sharp against the night sky. The mansion was massive, towering over the surrounding trees, its windows dark and empty. The gates were rusted, but they still creaked open when I pulled up, and I drove down the long, winding driveway to the house. I parked in front of the grand entrance, my heart pounding in my chest. The house was beautiful, in its own way. The architecture was old, regal even, but it had a decaying aura, as if the house itself was slowly dying. The windows, though dark, seemed to watch me, and a sense of unease settled in my stomach. But I pushed it aside. I was here for a reason, and I wasn't going to turn back now. I stepped out of the car and made my way to the front door, the rain still falling in sheets, soaking my jacket. The door creaked as I pushed it open, the sound echoing through the empty hall. Inside, the air was thick with dust, and the musty scent of mildew lingered in the air. I hesitated for a moment, but then stepped inside. The foyer was enormous, with high ceilings and a grand staircase that led to the second floor. Portraits lined the walls, their eyes seeming to follow me as I moved. The entire place had an oppressive feel, like the air itself was suffocating. But I was determined to explore. The rumors had intrigued me for years, and tonight I would finally get the answers I'd been searching for. I wandered deeper into the house, my footsteps echoing in the empty halls. The mansion was vast, with rooms that seemed to stretch on forever. I came across a library filled with old books that looked untouched by time. I ran my fingers over the spines, the dust thick beneath my touch, and I was about to leave when something caught my eye. A journal. Its leather cover was cracked and worn, the pages yellowed with age. I opened it, my curiosity piqued, and began to read. The entries were strange, frantic, almost paranoid. The writer spoke of voices in the walls, of shadows that moved on their own. They described a family cursed by something ancient, something evil that had taken root in the house. There was mention of rituals, sacrifices, and something that had been buried beneath the floorboards of the mansion. As I read, a chill ran down my spine. I closed the book quickly, my mind racing. What had happened in this place? Who had lived here? And why had they left? I stood up and turned to leave the room when I heard it. Faint, but unmistakable. A soft whisper coming from somewhere deeper in the house. I froze, my breath catching in my throat. It sounded like a voice, but it was too muffled to make out. My heart began to race as I stepped cautiously toward the source of the sound, my feet moving almost of their own accord. I followed the whispers down a narrow hallway, the walls closing in on me as the air grew colder. The sound grew louder, more distinct, and as I reached the end of the hall, I saw a door, half open, as though inviting me inside. I stepped through the door, my pulse pounding in my ears. The room was small, tucked away in the far corner of the house. The walls were lined with shelves, filled with strange objects, old candles, dried herbs, and peculiar trinkets. But what caught my attention was the floor. It was cracked, and there in the middle of the room was a hatch. The whispers were louder now, more urgent, as if something or someone was beckoning me. I knelt down, my hands trembling as I reached for the hatch, my mind telling me to turn back, but my curiosity keeping me rooted in place. I lifted it, revealing a narrow staircase leading down into the darkness below. I hesitated only for a moment before I stepped down, the cold air around me biting into my skin. The stairs creaked under my weight, the sound echoing in the silence of the house. As I descended, the whispers grew louder, almost deafening, and I could feel a sense of dread settling over me. At the bottom of the stairs, I found myself in a small chamber, the walls damp with moisture. A single candle flickered in the center of the room, casting an eerie glow across the floor. And then I saw it, a circle of symbols, carved into the stone floor, surrounding a deep pit. The walls were lined with strange markings, symbols that seemed to pulse with energy. My breath caught in my throat as I realized what I was looking at. This was no ordinary room. This was a ritual chamber. Suddenly, a voice, clear and strong, cut through the whispers. "You shouldn't have come." I spun around, but there was no one there. The air grew colder still, and I felt an overwhelming sense of dread, as if something was watching me. The symbols on the floor began to glow faintly, and the ground beneath me seemed to shift. I turned to run, but the door slammed shut behind me. The walls began to close in, the room shrinking around me. The whispers grew louder, frantic, like a chorus of voices, each one begging me to leave. But I couldn't move. My feet were rooted to the ground, my body paralyzed by fear. And then I saw it. A figure emerged from the shadows, tall, skeletal, its eyes empty voids. It reached out toward me with long, bony fingers, its mouth opening in a grotesque grin. "You shouldn't have come," it whispered again, its voice like the sound of rustling leaves. "Now, you're mine." I tried to scream, but no sound came out. The figure stepped closer, its cold breath washing over me, and I felt the darkness close in. The last thing I remember was the feeling of cold hands wrapping around my throat, tightening until I could no longer breathe. And then, nothing. The next morning, when the storm had passed, the mansion stood empty once more. No signs of life, no indication of the horrors that had unfolded within its walls. But the whispers lingered on the wind, faint but present, carried through the mountains. And anyone who wandered too close to Druxton Manor would hear them. "You shouldn't have come." I had always been the type of person who appreciated solitude. There was something comforting about being alone, away from the noise of the world. That's why I chose to rent a cabin in the middle of nowhere for the weekend. The online listing said it was secluded, a perfect place to escape the chaos and clear my mind. I didn't hesitate for a moment when I saw it. Nestled deep in the forest, miles from the nearest town. It was everything I had been looking for. Peaceful, quiet, undisturbed. The drive up was longer than I expected, and the roads were narrow and winding. The further I went, the more the trees seemed to close in around me. There were no streetlights, no signs of civilization, just the occasional bird call and the rustle of leaves. The forest was dense, so dense that it felt like the world beyond the trees didn't exist. The GPS had a hard time keeping up, but eventually, after what seemed like hours, I found the cabin. It was an old, rustic place, made of weathered wood with a stone chimney that stood tall against the backdrop of towering pines. The air was crisp and clean, and for a moment, I felt a deep sense of peace. I parked my car and grabbed my bags, heading toward the front door. The key was under the mat, just like the instructions said. I unlocked the door and stepped inside. The interior was cozy, if a bit dated. There was a fireplace, a small kitchen, and a set of windows that overlooked the woods. The furniture was simple but comfortable. Everything was exactly as I had hoped. I dropped my bags by the door, kicked off my shoes, and went to unpack. It wasn't long before I noticed the first odd thing about the cabin. It was too quiet. The kind of quiet that feels almost oppressive. No creaks in the floorboards, no sounds of wind outside, no distant animal calls. Just silence. I tried to ignore it, telling myself it was just the isolation, but it felt wrong, unnatural. That night, after a simple dinner of canned soup and crackers, I settled in front of the fireplace with a book, hoping to relax. But the silence was still there. Even the fire crackled quietly, almost muffled. I began to feel uneasy, as if something were watching me, waiting. I couldn't shake the feeling that I wasn't alone in the cabin. I tried to brush it off, but when I went to bed later that evening, I heard it. A soft scraping sound, faint at first, like something moving across the floorboards. My heart skipped a beat. I sat up, listening intently. It was coming from somewhere beneath me. The cabin had an attic, but it was locked, and I had made sure not to go up there. There was no way it could be coming from the attic. The sound continued, dragging itself across the wood. Closer now. I grabbed my phone and turned on the flashlight, shining it toward the door to the small bedroom. Nothing. The door was still closed. The room was still. But the scraping grew louder, more frantic, as if something was desperately trying to claw its way into my room. I leapt out of bed, my pulse pounding in my ears. I grabbed the nearest object, a heavy lamp, and moved toward the door. The floor beneath my feet creaked with every step I took. the silence outside the room too deafening. The scraping stopped the moment my hand touched the door handle. I stood there for a moment, frozen. A part of me wanted to open the door and check, but another part of me screamed to leave. I tried to push the fear down, telling myself it was nothing more than the wind or an animal trapped beneath the floor. But something told me it wasn't. Suddenly, there was a loud bang, like something heavy crashing against the door. I stumbled backward, my breath coming in shallow gasps. I couldn't move. I couldn't think. I backed away toward the window, and that's when I saw it. A shadow. It moved across the room, fluid and unnatural, crawling along the walls and ceiling. It was dark, inky black, and it seemed to blend into the darkness around it. The shadow slithered toward me, and I could feel its presence, like a weight on my chest. Before I could scream, the shadow stopped. It hovered near the door, its form stretching and distorting in ways that defied logic. I watched in horror as it started to take shape, growing, contorting into something grotesque. It had a face now, or what I could make out to be a face, though it was twisted beyond recognition. Its eyes were hollow, and its mouth stretched unnaturally wide, like it had been forced open. I couldn't look away. I was paralyzed by fear, unable to move, unable to breathe. And then it spoke. Leave. Its voice was like 1,000 whispers all at once, distorted and jagged. I could feel it scraping against my mind, gnawing at my sanity. I wanted to run, but I couldn't. I couldn't even blink. The thing in front of me wasn't real. It couldn't be. But it was. And it was coming closer. Leave, before it's too late. The door behind me slammed open with a violent crash, and I turned to see a figure standing in the doorway. A woman, pale and gaunt, her hair hanging in matted strands around her face. Her clothes were torn and weathered, as if she had been trapped in the cabin for years. Her eyes locked onto mine, empty and lifeless. I opened my mouth to scream, but no sound came out. The shadow in front of me began to advance, and the woman stepped into the room, her gaze fixed on me. Don't listen to it, she whispered, her voice hollow. It's already too late for me. I didn't know what she meant, but I didn't have time to figure it out. The shadow lunged toward me with lightning speed, and I barely had time to react before it enveloped me. Cold, suffocating, and all-consuming. The woman's voice echoed in my mind, a final warning as everything went black. When I woke up, I was outside the cabin, lying in the dirt by the front door. My body ached, and I was covered in a cold sweat. The storm had passed, and the world around me was eerily quiet. I stood up, disoriented, and glanced at the cabin. It was silent, empty. No sign of the woman, the shadow, or anything that had happened the night before. But the feeling of dread still clung to me, like a weight I couldn't shake. I left that day, abandoning the cabin and driving as fast as I could away from the forest. The road felt endless, and the shadows seemed to follow me, creeping at the edges of my vision. As I drove, I kept hearing the whisper, faint but persistent. Leave before it's too late. The message lingered long after I left the forest behind, a warning I could never forget. And as I look back now, I realize something terrifying. The thing in the cabin. It wasn't waiting for me to leave. It was waiting for the next person to come. And it always comes for the ones who stay. It had been a long week of work, and I needed a break. So when my friend invited me to spend a few days at his remote cabin in the mountains, I jumped at the chance. I had heard about the cabin for years, an old, secluded place tucked away in the dense woods, far from any nearby towns or neighbors. It seemed like the perfect escape from the stresses of everyday life. I wasn't sure exactly why my friend had decided to go there, but he assured me it was a peaceful getaway, a place to relax and enjoy nature. The drive up was beautiful, but eerie. The further we went, the less familiar the landscape became. The trees grew thicker, and the roads more winding and narrow. The air grew cooler and the daylight faded quickly as we reached the base of the mountains. My friend John, who had been there a few times before, seemed unbothered, but I could feel the unsettling quiet that surrounded us. It was like the world outside was shutting down, as if we were being swallowed by the wilderness. The cabin was everything I imagined it would be: old, rustic, and somewhat weathered. It had an air of history about it, with its wooden beams and creaky floors. There was something comforting about it, but also something vaguely unsettling. The door creaked open with a loud groan as we entered, the smell of wood and dust filling the air. "I'll show you around," John said, leading me inside. "It's small, but it's all we need." We dropped our bags by the door and he led me through the rooms. The cabin had a small living area with a fireplace, a tiny kitchen, and 2 bedrooms upstairs. The windows were covered with heavy curtains, blocking out much of the sunlight. It was cozy, but I couldn't shake the feeling that the place was watching me, like there was something hidden beneath its aged exterior. That night, as we sat by the fire, the atmosphere seemed to shift. The wind outside howled through the trees, and the rain began to fall in sheets, hitting the windows with a constant rhythmic tapping. It was the kind of storm that made you want to stay inside and never leave. We talked for a while, sipping our drinks, but there was an odd tension in the air. Every now and then, I would catch John glancing toward the door, as if he was expecting someone or something. As the evening wore on, I began to feel it, a strange presence, as if the cabin itself was alive. The walls seemed to breathe with each gust of wind, and the shadows in the corners grew longer, more distorted. Every time I looked away, I could have sworn I saw movement in the peripheral. I shook it off, convincing myself it was just my imagination, the product of being too far from civilization. But then, as we were sitting in silence, I heard it, a faint tapping from somewhere above us. I froze, my heart skipping a beat. I turned to John, who had gone pale. "It's nothing," he said quickly, standing up. "It's probably just an animal in the attic or something." But the tapping continued, growing louder and more deliberate. Tap, tap, tap. It was rhythmic now, like a steady knock. I stood up, my legs stiff with unease, and made my way toward the staircase that led up to the attic. "John," I said, my voice barely above a whisper, "and what is that?" He didn't respond. Instead, he stood frozen in the center of the room, his face white. He had been to the cabin many times, yet he was acting as if something wasn't right. My unease grew into full-blown fear, and I felt an overwhelming urge to leave. But I couldn't. Something was pulling me to the attic, as if I had to know what was up there. I ascended the stairs slowly, the sound of my footsteps echoing through the quiet house. The tapping stopped when I reached the top of the stairs, and a cold chill swept through the air. The door to the attic was slightly ajar, just enough to let me see the darkness beyond. I reached for the handle, my hand shaking, and pushed it open. The attic was dark, the only light coming from the faint glow of the moon through a small window at the far end. The floorboards creaked underfoot, and I felt the weight of the silence pressing down on me. My eyes scanned the room, searching for the source of the tapping, but there was nothing there. No sign of movement, no animal in sight. And yet, something felt off. I stepped deeper into the attic, and that's when I saw it. In the corner of the room, covered by a dusty sheet, was an old rocking chair. The chair was moving slightly as if something had just gotten up from it. My breath caught in my throat as I stepped closer, the hairs on the back of my neck standing up. I lifted the sheet, and there it was, a small wooden box. It was old, the wood cracked and worn with age. It was nothing special, just a plain box. But as soon as I touched it, a coldness shot through me. I picked it up, and the moment my fingers made contact, the room seemed to grow darker, the temperature dropping rapidly. I could hear the wind outside, but it felt distant, as if I were no longer in the same world. I turned the box over in my hands, and something fell out, a small yellowed photograph. I held it up to the light, trying to make sense of it. It was a picture of a family, 2 parents and a young child, all standing in front of the cabin smiling, but their faces were all scratched out, the eyes and mouths gouged away, as if someone had deliberately destroyed their identities. "John!" I called out, panic rising in my chest. "What is this?" John appeared in the doorway, his face twisted with fear. He looked at the photograph and then at me, his eyes filled with dread. You shouldn't have found that, he said, his voice shaking. You need to leave now. Why? I asked, my voice barely audible. What's going on? Who are these people? John stepped forward, his face pale. They're the reason we don't come up here. They never left. And now neither will we. Suddenly, the temperature in the room plummeted, and the air became thick with something heavy, suffocating. I heard footsteps behind me, slow and deliberate, as if someone or something was coming up the stairs. John's eyes widened in terror. Get out now, he screamed. I turned to run, but before I could make it to the stairs, I felt a cold hand grasp my shoulder, pulling me back into the darkness of the attic. I spun around, my heart racing, but there was nothing there, nothing but the sound of distant whispers and the creaking of the rocking chair. John was gone. I ran down the stairs, my breath coming in sharp gasps, but when I reached the bottom, the door to the cabin was locked. I could hear the sound of footsteps approaching, slow and deliberate, like someone or something was walking toward me. And then I heard the voice. You should have never come here. The words were cold, chilling, and they echoed in the empty cabin. I turned and saw them, figures in the dark, standing in the doorway, the family from the photograph. Their faces were no longer obscured, but twisted, their eyes hollow and empty, staring into my soul. You should have never come, they whispered, their voices like 1,000 broken whispers, overlapping and twisting. I ran, but no matter where I went, the footsteps followed. The whispers never stopped, and I knew, as the darkness consumed me, that I would never leave. Not alive, not whole, because the cabin had claimed me, just like it had claimed them. I had always been a city person. The constant hum of traffic, the bustle of people, the lights that never seemed to go out, it was all I had ever known. So when my uncle offered me his remote cabin in the woods for a weekend getaway, I was hesitant at first. He had been talking about it for years, but I had always dismissed it as something for people who wanted to escape the hustle and bustle, as he put it. I didn't understand the appeal, but after a particularly grueling month of work, I decided to take him up on the offer. I figured a weekend of quiet might help me clear my head. The cabin was about 3 hours away from the city, tucked deep in the woods, where even cell reception was spotty at best. I drove down winding roads that seemed to disappear into the trees, each mile feeling more isolated than the last. The closer I got, the more I felt a sense of unease creeping up on me. But I chalked it up to the unfamiliarity of it all. After all, I was just going to spend a few nights in a cabin. How bad could it be? I finally arrived just as the sun was beginning to set, casting long shadows over the forest. The cabin stood at the edge of a small clearing, surrounded by thick trees that seemed to close in around it. It was older than I expected, weathered wood, with ivy crawling up the sides, and a stone chimney that had seen better days. The door creaked when I opened it, and I was greeted by the smell of pine, damp wood, and something else. Something faintly unpleasant, like mold or mildew. But I shrugged it off. I wasn't here for luxury, after all. The inside of the cabin was simple but cozy. A small kitchen, a fireplace, a couple of chairs, and a large window that looked out over the woods. There was an old wooden staircase leading up to the loft, where I assumed the bedroom was. I dropped my bags and started a fire in the hearth to chase away the chill in the air. As the fire crackled and the darkness outside deepened, I settled into one of the chairs with a book, hoping to relax and forget about the demands of work. But the longer I sat there, the more the silence seemed to press in on me. It wasn't peaceful. It was unnerving. The wind outside howled through the trees, but beyond that there was no sound. No animals, no rustling of leaves, no distant voices. Just an oppressive, suffocating quiet. I shook off the feeling and decided to head upstairs to bed, figuring the isolation would be easier to handle if I just got some rest. But as I reached the top of the stairs, something caught my eye. A door at the far end of the loft, tucked behind a thick curtain of ivy that had found its way inside. I didn't remember seeing that door on the floor plan, and there was something about it that made my skin crawl. It wasn't locked, and I was too curious to ignore it. I pushed the door open and found myself looking into a small, dusty room. The air was thick and stale, and the window was covered with a thick layer of grime. But it wasn't the room itself that unsettled me. It was what was inside. A rocking chair sat in the center of the room, facing the wall, with a thick layer of dust on the seat. But the thing that chilled me to the bone was the small, torn doll that lay in the chair's lap. Its eyes were black buttons, and its mouth was stitched crookedly, as if it had been hastily sewn together. It felt wrong, like it didn't belong. I backed out of the room quickly, the hairs on my neck standing on end. I slammed the door shut and hurried to bed, not bothering to check the rest of the house. Whatever that room was, I didn't want to know. I tried to sleep, but the house felt like it was closing in on me. Every creak of the floorboards, every whisper of wind outside made my heart race. I finally managed to drift off into an uneasy sleep, but that's when the dream started. In the dream, I was standing in the same small room, but this time, the rocking chair was moving. Slowly at first, creaking with each forward motion. I couldn't see who or what was in the chair, but I could feel it. The presence in the room was suffocating. I tried to move, but my feet were rooted to the spot. The rocking chair creaked louder, faster, as if something was drawing closer to me. And then I heard it, the soft whisper of a voice, barely audible over the sound of the rocking. Leave. I woke up with a start, gasping for air, my heart pounding in my chest. I sat up in bed, drenched in sweat, and looked around the room. Everything was still, but the sense of unease hadn't lifted. If anything, it had intensified. I couldn't shake the feeling that something was watching me from the shadows, waiting for me to make a mistake. The next day, I decided to head into town to grab some supplies, anything to distract myself from the strange feeling in the cabin. As I drove down the narrow road, I passed a small general store. I stopped, hoping to get something to drink and maybe have a chat with the locals. Inside, the store was dimly lit, the shelves stocked with items that looked like they hadn't been touched in years. The cashier, an older woman with piercing eyes, gave me a long, calculating look as I walked in. "First time at the cabin, eh?" she asked, her voice low and gravelly. I nodded, trying to shake off the unease that had settled in my gut. "Yeah, just here for a few days." She leaned over the counter, her eyes narrowing. "You shouldn't stay there." I felt a chill run down my spine. "Why?" The woman hesitated, her gaze flickering to the window, as if she were checking to see if anyone was listening. Then she spoke in a near whisper. "That cabin, it's cursed. People who stay there don't come back the same. You should leave, before it's too late." I laughed nervously, thinking she was just some eccentric local trying to spook me. But the look in her eyes told me she wasn't joking. There was genuine fear there. I thanked her and left, my mind racing with questions. What was she talking about? Cursed? That didn't make sense. But as I drove back to the cabin, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was terribly wrong. The air was thick with tension, and the trees seemed to loom closer to the road, as if they were reaching out to block my way. When I returned to the cabin, the door was slightly ajar. I was sure I had locked it when I left. I pushed it open cautiously and stepped inside. Everything was exactly as I had left it, except for one thing. The rocking chair was no longer in the room. It had been moved, not just out of the room, but into the center of the living room, facing me. And the doll was sitting in the chair. I froze. My blood ran cold as I stared at it, the black button eyes staring back at me. I took a hesitant step forward, but the floorboards creaked beneath my feet, and the chair rocked once, then twice, as if it were alive. I turned and ran. I didn't stop to grab my things, didn't look back. I bolted out the door into the woods and didn't stop running until I reached my car. I drove without looking back, my heart pounding in my chest. I didn't care where I went. I just had to get away. I never went back to that cabin. I didn't need to. I had learned enough. Some places are meant to be left alone, and some things are better left undisturbed. The cabin in the woods was one of those places. And the doll? I've heard that it's still there, waiting for the next person to make the mistake of staying too long. I had always been a skeptic, someone who dismissed any talk of the supernatural as nonsense. I grew up in a family that valued logic and reason, and for years, I carried that belief with me. Ghosts, spirits, curses, none of it made sense to me. That was until one winter evening when I decided to visit an old friend who'd recently moved to a small town on the outskirts of nowhere. He invited me to his cabin for the weekend, and since I had nothing else going on, I agreed. Little did I know that this weekend would change everything I thought I knew about the world. The drive up was long, the roads winding through thick forests and barren landscapes. The town itself seemed to be stuck in time, with old, weathered buildings and streets that were almost too quiet. It was as if the whole place had been abandoned, but for some reason, there were still people living here. The air was thick with the scent of pine and cold, and I felt a strange shiver run through me as I drove deeper into the woods. When I finally reached my friend's cabin, it was nearly dark. The cabin was nestled against a backdrop of towering trees with a thin trail of smoke curling from the chimney. My friend Greg was waiting outside, waving me in. He looked like he was doing better, less stressed, more relaxed. But there was something about him that seemed off. His smile didn't quite reach his eyes, and he was a little too eager for me to come inside. I didn't think much of it, though. After all, we hadn't seen each other in years. Inside, the cabin was cozy, with a roaring fire in the hearth and a small table set for dinner. It was the kind of place that felt safe, like a retreat from the outside world. We sat down and caught up over dinner, talking about old times and our lives since we last met. But as the evening wore on, I noticed something unsettling. The longer I was there, the more the cabin seemed to feel wrong. There was a low, almost imperceptible hum in the air, a vibration that seemed to come from the walls themselves. It wasn't loud, but it was persistent, like the cabin was alive in some way. And the shadows, they were strange. They seemed to move, twist, and stretch in unnatural ways, even when no one was near them. Greg, too, seemed different. He would look over his shoulder often as though expecting something or someone watching him. I could see the strain on his face, the way his eyes darted around the room, never fully relaxed. At one point, he even stopped mid-sentence and just stared at the wall, his face going pale. When I asked him what was wrong, he quickly brushed it off. But the nervous energy he gave off was palpable. "I'm just tired," he said, forcing a smile. "It's been a long week." But I knew something was wrong. The air felt thick, heavy with an unspoken tension. The more I looked around the room, the more I felt like I wasn't alone. It was as if something was lurking in the corners, just out of sight, waiting. I excused myself to use the bathroom, needing a moment to collect my thoughts. But when I walked down the narrow hall toward the bathroom, I noticed something strange. At the end of the hallway, there was a door. It wasn't there when I first arrived, or at least I didn't notice it. It was old, weathered, with a tarnished doorknob and a faint outline of scratches around the edges. I couldn't help myself. I had to know what was behind it. I reached for the doorknob, but just as my fingers touched it, I heard a voice. Greg's voice, faint but clear, coming from behind me. "Don't open it!" I spun around, heart racing, but there was no one there. I felt the hairs on the back of my neck stand up, my pulse quickening. I glanced back at the door. The voice had been so real, so close. I was convinced I had heard it. But when I returned to the living room, Greg was sitting by the fire, his eyes wide with fear. He was staring directly at me, as if he could see right through me. "Don't go near that door," he said, his voice shaking. "Why?" I asked, confused and unnerved by his sudden outburst. "What's behind it?" He didn't answer at first, his gaze flickering toward the door. Then, finally, he spoke. "It's not just a door, it's a way out, or a way in. But you don't want to know which." I stared at him, the weight of his words sinking in. I laughed nervously, trying to brush it off as some kind of joke. But there was no humor in his eyes, only fear. The tension in the room had become unbearable, thick and suffocating. That night I couldn't sleep. The low hum from the walls kept me awake. The feeling of being watched never leaving me. At one point, I woke up to the sound of footsteps outside the cabin. Slow, deliberate, as if someone was walking in the snow just beyond the window. I tried to shake it off, but when I looked out the window, there was no one there. The next morning, Greg was gone. His bed was empty, the sheets rumpled as though he had gotten up in the middle of the night. I called out for him, but there was no answer. The house felt even more oppressive now, the silence deafening. I searched the cabin, checking every room, but he was nowhere to be found. The only thing I found was the door at the end of the hallway, standing ajar. Against my better judgment, I stepped toward it. My heart pounded in my chest as I reached for the knob and turned it slowly. The door creaked open, revealing a small, dimly lit room. It was empty, except for one thing. In the center of the room, there was a mirror. It was old, with a tarnished frame, and its surface was covered in dust. But the moment I looked into it, I froze. The reflection was distorted, flickering like a broken TV screen. For a split second, I saw Greg's face, his eyes wide with terror, his mouth open as if screaming. But the reflection didn't match the movement of my own body. It was as if something else, something ancient, was looking back at me. I stumbled back from the mirror, my breath coming in short gasps. The room felt colder now, and I could hear a faint whispering, like 1,000 voices murmuring from somewhere deep inside the cabin. And then I heard Greg's voice again, but this time, it was coming from inside the mirror. "Help me!" I slammed the door shut and ran from the cabin, not stopping until I was safely in my car. As I drove away, I looked back at the cabin one last time, but what I saw made my blood run cold. Greg was standing in the window, staring at me with hollow eyes. His mouth moved, but no sound came out. Then, the door at the end of the hallway swung open and the darkness inside seemed to swallow him whole. I've never been back to that cabin. I don't think I ever will. But sometimes, when I close my eyes, I can still hear the whispering, feel the cold, and see Greg's face in that mirror, trapped just like the rest of them. I never believed in ghosts. I'd grown up in a house that people said was haunted, but to me, it was just an old, creaky building. Sure, there were strange noises at night, and the house was always colder than it should have been, but I never thought much of it. It was just old plumbing, drafts, and the house settling. My friends used to joke about it being haunted, but I never took them seriously. That was until the night I decided to stay at my childhood home for one last time. I'd moved away to the city years ago, and after my parents passed, the house had been left to me. I hadn't been back in months, but there was something about the upcoming winter season that made me want to return. Maybe I wanted to say goodbye, or maybe I just wanted closure. Whatever the reason, I found myself standing at the front door of the old house, one cold December evening, the wind howling around me. The place looked exactly as I remembered: overgrown garden, peeling paint, and the crooked front steps. The moment I stepped inside, the familiar smell of old wood and dust hit me. It was strange, almost comforting, but I felt an eerie chill creep up my spine as I closed the door behind me. The house felt different this time, more oppressive, more alive. I walked through the old hallway, my footsteps echoing through the emptiness. The floorboards creaked under my weight, and I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched. I told myself it was just the unfamiliarity of being back after so long, but the feeling wouldn't go away. I decided to spend the night in the master bedroom, the room I'd grown up in. It was at the far end of the hallway, past the staircase that creaked with every step. The room still looked the same, though dust had settled over everything and the once vibrant wallpaper had faded with time. I opened the window to let in some fresh air and threw my suitcase on the bed. The storm outside had picked up, the wind howling like a pack of wolves. I settled in with a cup of tea, trying to push away the sense of unease that seemed to cling to every corner of the house. But then I heard it, a soft tapping sound coming from the hallway. At first I thought it was just the house settling, but the tapping continued. It was rhythmic, slow, deliberate. It was almost like someone was knocking on the walls. I stood up, my heart pounding in my chest. I didn't want to check, but something inside me urged me to do so. I slowly opened the door, peering out into the dark hallway. The house was silent again, save for the wind outside. But as I stepped into the hallway, I heard it. Soft footsteps coming from the stairs. I froze, my breath catching in my throat. The footsteps were slow, deliberate, and seemed to be heading down toward me. But there was no one there. I backed up into my room, slamming the door shut behind me. I sat on the bed, my heart racing, trying to convince myself that I was just imagining things. The wind outside howled louder, and the house creaked and groaned. Then the lights flickered. They went out, plunging the house into darkness. I fumbled for my phone, turning on the flashlight. My hand trembled as I pointed the beam down the hallway. The footsteps were still there, faint but unmistakable. And then I heard something else, whispering, low and guttural, coming from the direction of the stairs. "Help me!" The voice was barely a whisper, but it was clear. It was coming from somewhere deep within the house. I couldn't move. My body was frozen with fear. The whisper grew louder, more desperate, as if whoever was calling out needed my help. But I knew better than to answer. I grabbed my things and rushed down the stairs, my heart pounding in my chest. The footsteps behind me continued, growing louder, closer. I turned to look, but there was nothing there, just darkness. At the foot of the stairs, I stopped. In the dim light from my phone, I saw something I couldn't explain. The front door, which had been shut when I entered, was now wide open. The wind outside had stopped, and the night was unnervingly still. "Leave!" The whisper was now clear, and it came from the open doorway. I didn't wait. I ran out of the house, down the crooked front steps, and into the cold night. I didn't stop until I was in my car, speeding away from the house that had once been my home. As I drove away, I looked back through the rearview mirror. The house was dark, but the lights in the upstairs bedroom flickered on for just a moment. And in the window, I swear I saw a figure standing there, staring back at me. I've never gone back. I don't know what I saw that night, but I do know one thing. Some places are better left forgotten. Some voices are better left unheard. The house on the hill? It wasn't just haunted by memories. It was haunted by something else. And whatever it was still waiting for someone to listen. I don't know what it wanted from me, but I have a feeling it wasn't the last time I would hear its whispers. I had never believed in the superstitions surrounding the old church at the edge of town. It was a dilapidated structure, long abandoned, that most of the locals referred to as the Hollow Church. It had been that way for years, overgrown with vines, the bell tower falling apart, and windows shattered, leaving only dark, empty spaces where glass once was. The stories about it, how it was cursed, how people who entered never returned the same, had been told for generations. But I'd always dismissed them. After all, I was a rational person. Superstitions didn't hold any power over me. But that was before winter came. It was a bitterly cold evening, the kind where the air felt like sharp needles against the skin. Snow had been falling for hours, and everything outside was blanketed in white. The town, small and isolated, seemed even more deserted than usual. My car was parked outside my house, but the weather was getting worse. I decided to take a walk through the woods that lay between my house and the old church. The cold air seemed to press against me, the wind biting at my cheeks. But there was something oddly compelling about the church. I had passed by it countless times, but tonight, something felt different. Maybe it was the way the light from the setting sun reflected off the snow, casting eerie shadows. Or perhaps it was the silence, broken only by the distant howl of the wind. But something tugged at me, drawing me toward it. I don't know why I went in, but as I walked closer, I couldn't shake the feeling that I had to. The church loomed ahead, dark and imposing, like an ancient guardian of secrets long forgotten. I pushed open the heavy wooden door, which creaked on its hinges, sending a chill down my spine. Inside, the air was colder than it was outside. A strange dampness filled the space, and the floor was covered in layers of old dust and dirt. The once beautiful stained glass windows now looked like shattered remnants of a nightmare, casting broken light patterns on the floor. I stepped inside, my boots crunching on the debris. The faint scent of decay was thick in the air, and for a moment, I thought I heard something, a whisper, a faint movement in the shadows. But when I turned, the church was still, just the silence and the oppressive weight of the place. I wandered further into the church, my steps echoing off the stone walls. There was something unsettling about the way the place seemed to close in around me, the high vaulted ceiling pressing down like a physical force. And then I noticed it, the altar. The altar stood at the far end of the church, covered in a dark cloth that was stained and torn. But what caught my eye were the candles. There were hundreds of them, flickering with a pale, sickly light. They weren't the type of candles that belonged in a church. They were strange, black, and twisted, and the wax dripped in odd patterns, forming symbols that I couldn't recognize. I approached it, my curiosity getting the best of me. As I got closer, I felt a sharp tug at the back of my neck, a sensation as if someone or something was watching me. My heart began to race, but I couldn't stop myself from reaching out to touch one of the candles. As soon as my fingers brushed against it, the temperature in the room plummeted. The air turned icy and I felt a cold hand on my shoulder. I spun around, but no one was there. I felt a pressure building in my chest, like something was trying to crush the air from my lungs. And then I saw it. At the back of the church, standing just beyond the altar, was a figure. It was tall, cloaked in black, with an almost indistinguishable face. The figure was still unmoving, as if waiting for something. My heart raced, panic flooding my veins. "Who's there?" I called, my voice shaky. The figure didn't respond, but I saw the shadows shift. Slowly it began to move, taking one step forward, then another. Each step echoed in the silence, sending waves of dread through me. I backed away, my breath coming faster now, but I couldn't look away. It was like a magnetic pull, as if I was bound to the figure, drawn to it. I stumbled backward, tripping over debris, but I couldn't tear my eyes from it. The closer it came, the darker the room became. The candles flickered violently, casting strange, elongated shadows across the walls. The figure's presence seemed to drain the warmth from the room, replacing it with an unbearable cold. Just as it reached the altar, I heard a voice, soft, guttural, and filled with ancient malice. "Leave now, before it's too late." The voice came from everywhere and nowhere at once, reverberating in my mind. I tried to move, but my body refused to obey. I felt rooted to the ground, unable to tear my eyes from the figure. The dark cloak moved like a living thing, and the figure's face began to shift, its features warping and distorting. I couldn't breathe. I couldn't think. Then, in an instant, everything went black. I woke up in the snow, my face numb from the cold. I was outside the church, lying on the ground as if I had been thrown out. My body ached as if I had been dragged, and the church loomed behind me, silent and still. I tried to stand, but my legs felt weak, as if I had been paralyzed for hours. I could hear my pulse thundering in my ears, but my mind was blank. I stumbled away from the church, not daring to look back. The town felt miles away, and the path ahead was unclear. All I could think of was the figure and the voice, the warning. As I walked home, the wind had picked up again, the snow swirling in thick flurries. The darkness seemed to stretch longer than usual, and I felt a weight on my chest, a sense of unease that wouldn't leave. I tried to tell myself that I was just imagining things, that I had been lost in the snow and had hallucinated the whole encounter. But deep down, I knew better. The church had changed me. It had left something in me, something dark, something that I couldn't escape. I felt it following me, lurking in the back of my mind. And when I closed my eyes at night, I could still hear the voice, "Leave now, before it's too late." I never returned to the church, and I never spoke of what happened to anyone. But sometimes, late at night, when the wind howls just right, I can still hear the echoes of footsteps, and I can feel the cold hand on my shoulder once more. The hollow church is still out there, waiting, watching, and I know I can never go back.